We'll collect questions at the end of this session. So it's my pleasure to introduce you Very Reverend Archpriest Mark Morozowich, Professor of Liturgy at the Catholic University of America, and he holds a chair of Ukrainian Church Studies. So his presentation will focus on liturgical exchange and influence between the Eastern Catholic churches and Orthodox churches in the US. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and let me extend my thank you to the organizers of this wonderful symposium. I think that any time we can come together and work together toward unity is an important thing, and especially for the importance for us as Eastern Catholics to reflect on the role in ecumenical dialogues helps to develop our own historical conscience, but as well, hopefully, to stimulate future work in the ecumenical sphere. The divisions in the body of Christ need to be healed, and each one of us plays an important role in bringing about that healing. My intervention will focus on liturgy and the impact in the relationships between Eastern Catholic and Orthodox churches, specifically in the United States. The interesting history of these churches, coupled with the reality of being minority communities in a pluralistic society, serve as a broader context not to be forgotten. When you're less than 1% of a society, banding together oftentimes becomes extremely important. Also, I'd like to accentuate the important role of the official ecumenical discussions of the joint Catholic and Orthodox dialogue in the United States, of which our own Monsignor Paul McPartland has been a member, and just to accentuate that they've published over 30 documents which were reports or statements, and even there were some Eastern Catholics that did participate as members of that discussion. So as we try to understand the current status of the relationship, I always like to go to history. And we're going to look a little bit at pre-Vatican Council history and some real-life situations. I would love to go into a much longer presentation, but unfortunately they limit me here. But I've decided to make this about my own experience and to share that because it gives you a glimpse into one facet. It's impossible to talk about the relationships with the Armenians, the Greek Orthodox, and whatnot in such a quick break. So, me, a Ukrainian Catholic young man, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, yes, during the Second Vatican Council. So I have no particular memory of a preconciliar church and no sense of what that was like. I am the child of my parents, who are both Ukrainian Catholics, involved in their church, very involved with the Ukrainian Catholic Youth League. And they spoke about the difficulties of the relationships between, specifically in this case, the Ukrainian Orthodox and the Ukrainian Catholic. And I remember vividly my mother saying, well, you know, I couldn't be a bridesmaid for my Orthodox friends. And this sort of curtailing of things was a part of it. And really, there were contentious relationships between the two churches focused upon property ownership, whether it was the eparchy who owned it or the parish council. And this started in the 40s and 50s as the Ukrainian Catholic Church was following the Latin Church and standardizing this ownership structure. So numerous Ukrainian Catholic churches in the United States then switched sides from Catholic to Orthodox, and new Catholic churches had to be built, especially as the case of St. Peter and Paul and Carnegie that became Orthodox. And now these were complex ideas about ownership. They weren't about liturgical ritual purity, I can assure you. Now, just as a parenthesis to an earlier period, of course, in the 19th century, we know of the famous, renowned Archbishop Ireland, who would not accept married priests. And so that lurks in the background of all of this. But if you go and look at the pictures of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the 40s and 50s, time of these problems, and even into the 70s, I'm sure, you will see pictures of First Holy Communion celebrations, icons showing devotions to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, just to name a few. And likewise, when I went to Ukraine my first time in 1994 and traveled to a village church in Morozowich that happened to be Orthodox, they had the same icons. So this idea of sort of this ritual purity is something that wasn't at play in this pre-Vatican Council idea. Certainly, I uphold and am a staunch proponent of the Second Vatican Council's impetus toward healing these breaks, and of course toward an identity of who we are. I will just call to mind Orientalium Ecclesiarum, number 6. All members of the Eastern Rite should know and be convinced that they can and should always preserve their legitimate liturgical rite and their established way of life, and that these may not be altered, except to obtain for themselves an organic improvement. All these then must be observed by the members of the Eastern Rite themselves. Besides, they should attain to an even greater knowledge and a more exact use of them. And if in their regard they have fallen short owing to contingencies of time and persons, they should take the steps to return to their ancestral traditions. And I would also like to point, in addition to this, because Sacrosanctum Concilium was sort of the basis behind this and talking about returning to our roots and understanding liturgy, that also plays an important part in this taking steps to look at our ancestral traditions. So there was a greater sense of engagement that began in the 70s and the 80s, certainly saw a wealth of renewal of liturgical expression. The immediate aftermath of the council had great upheaval even within the seminaries and people who were pro-Eastern, pro-Western. By the time I entered this seminary in the 1980s at St. Basil's in Stamford, Connecticut, they were still there, but they were moving forward. Certainly, my own bishop, Robert Mascal of the Eparchy of St. Josephat in Parma, was one of the leaders of returning to that tradition, and the churches were making steps to be together. Certainly, the 1988 celebration of the millennium of Ukrainian Christianity provided moments not only for cultural interaction, as we did in the Lincoln Center in New York, but as well prayer services joint between Catholic and Orthodox. And I can remember that summer in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the center of the city at Point State Park, as Catholics and Orthodox got together publicly and prayed. It might have been one of the first times in the city and marked and indeed an important part of coming together. So these are just some individual elements of how things were moving together. But as we reflect upon that Orientalium Ecclesiarum statement about returning to our ancestral traditions, certainly the work of liturgists looms large. And while I've focused for part of my paper on sort of a ground level look, we also have to keep in mind those great people who are leading the academic world. And the first person I'd like to call to mind here is the seminal American Orthodox theologian, Father Alexander Schmemann. His leadership and impactful publications certainly placed the Orthodox Church of America's St. Vladimir Seminary in New York as a leading powerhouse of Eastern liturgical theology. In fact, his work went beyond the Eastern and Orthodox world and even to the Latin Church, and I would say even as far as the Protestant liturgical theologians. His seminal book, Introduction to Liturgical Theology, published in 1966, immediately following the Second Vatican Council, provided reflections that brought together a whole way of understanding the liturgy, nourished, of course, on the Orthodox liturgy, or our own Byzantine liturgy, and really brought alive a new way of looking at liturgy and understanding this. I can share firsthand with you that Monsignor Kevin Irwin, as well of Catholic University, in his own seminal book, Context and Text, already now in the second edition, was reflecting on the work of Schmemann in my seminar in the academic year 1990-91. And we were looking at what were the unique points of his methodology and how they might be incorporated. So that just gives you one concrete glimpse of that. And I would be remiss if I didn't point to Father John Meyendorff, especially on his work on marriage and the impact that that had upon liturgical studies. So again, this is a blitzkrieg of people, and in this institution, I would be very remiss if I didn't mention our own Father Robert Taft. His impressive portfolio of publications, both liturgical and historical works, and liturgical theological reflections, were received well, both within church circles and even from the outside. And Father Taft, being no one to mince words, reflected many times about this task and what were some of the issues that needed to happen and what were some of the ways that we could dispense with these Latinizing tendencies. I'm going to quote to you from a speech that he gave during the encounter of Eastern Catholic Bishops of America and Oceania in Boston in 1999. So Taft is speaking on the issue of Zion or teplota, the addition of hot water. Some Greek Catholics, more Catholic than the Pope, will still appeal to outdated suppression of Zion at the Council of Zamość. This author himself has experienced personally the scruples of Latinized Eastern Catholic priests, fearful that if too much Zion is added to the consecrated wine, it would induce the Lord to take his leave. The general theory among Catholic adherents to this quantitative rather than symbolic sacramental theology is that the chalice mixture must contain 2/3 wine for validity. As the evidence adduced by J.M. Hansen's shows, however, one would be hard put to demonstrate that there was only 1/3 water in the cups of early Christians consecrated. And the first authoritative insistence on adding to the chalice only a small amount of water is found in the canon of 814, the pre-Vatican II Latin Rite Codex Juris Canonici, a disciplinary creed that does not concern Eastern usage in any way, end quote. So this is the type of scholarly work that was happening that helped us to understand things. Now, the speech received great applause, but I do remember one bishop, and the name will be left from my memoirs to protect his identity, who was scandalized and was in shock even the next day, not believing that his stances that were left uncritiqued, probably since his days in the seminary, made him not to be a good Catholic. So it's this type of work that the intellectuals do that bring us forward. And I also would give a shout out to Father Peter Galadza for his lifetime work, and especially to his 1991 article entitled Restoring the Icon, Reflections on the Reform of Byzantine Worship. And these efforts have been clearly instrumental in making a change. So in the United States, as I said, our at least in the Ukrainian Catholic experience with the Orthodox at that time, was different. It wasn't so much even about a liturgical purity. Certainly there were those people who had that. But there was an interest in taking seriously these demands of the Second Vatican Council, both Orientale Ecclesiarum, as well as Sacrosanctum Concilium. So I'm going to share with you a couple of liturgical developments that are happening and that are happening still to this day in Eastern Catholic as well as Orthodox churches. Again, coming out of this critical research and study. So one of the key ones that I believe very strongly in is the restoration of the sacraments of initiation to one ceremony. And this is something as well on the instruction for the implementation of the norms that was issued in 1996 by the East Oriental, as the time it was known as the Congregation, now the Dicastery, stressed about that as well as we saw within the canon law itself. So certainly we should be all aware of the ideal of celebrating baptism within the Easter Vigil at the Sunday evening Vesperal Divine Liturgy. And many parishes following the seminal work of Alexander Schmemann in his 1976 book of Water and the Spirit, a liturgical study of baptism. 1976. Now, in my own experience, this was put into place, again, referring to Bishop Robert Muskell, in 1991, when we had this clergy training and implemented this practice. And again, it was about restoring communion to infants. So the whole package together, and so really repristining the tradition. Another important issue that is out there in the world, and something that we in liturgical realms talk about, is the oral recitation of the anaphora for both the Eucharistic liturgies of St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great. So if we look at the nature and structure of the liturgy highlighted in Sacra Concilium, as we challenged the world, the church, to look at who is the community of God, who is the assembly, the body of Christ in prayer. And Taft himself touched this in his article. Was the Eucharist anaphora recited secretly or aloud? The ancient tradition and what became of it. His non-confessional treatise surveys the evidence and accentuates the importance of a council, generally well regarded, the Council of Trullo in 692, which mandated that the anaphora be recited aloud. This decree indicated that it was slipping from practice, but that it was to be recited in the manner for the entire community to prayer. Both Byzantine Orthodox and Catholic jurisdictions in the United States have various experiences of implementing this restoration of the practice that is not only ancient, but makes sense from a theological, liturgical, as well as a pastoral point of view. One last evidence for this movement and the impact of the academic world is the restoration of the kiss of peace during the Byzantine liturgy. This practice of extending the pre-creed kiss of peace from just something shared among the elite clergy to include the entire community is a restoration of an ancient order that encouraged the community to put aside their differences as they prepared for the Eucharistic celebration. Father Taft outlined the history of this ritual in his book on the Great Entrance, already published in 1972. So many different priests have introduced this, and at least in the Ukrainian Catholic Archieparchy of Philadelphia, it was encouraged in the year 2015 to be celebrated at least on holy days. I have been in the presence of the Greek Orthodox celebrations where Archbishop Elpidophorus likewise extended this to the entire congregation. And again, returning to our own Father Peter Galadza, he asks a provocative question on exactly this point. If there is love, why does no one exchange the kiss of peace? So the impact of research makes an incredible contribution because it's seeking the truth and it strives to reflect on the incredible inspirations that God provides for his Christian communities. And it's amazing how this happens. Just a few weeks ago, at the Conference of Alexandrinian Liturgy, sponsored by the Institute for the Study of Eastern Christianity at the Catholic University of America, our featured speaker, Bishop Kyrillos, a Coptic Orthodox bishop, delivered a talk, From Conference to Sanctuary, How Modern Scholarly Research Contributes to the History, Theology, and Practice of the Coptic Orthodox Church. His noteworthy presentation included quotes directly to the principles of the Second Vatican Council's Sacrosanctum Concilium when evaluating the liturgical experience of his own Coptic Orthodox Church. So even beyond this Byzantine world of people that I've been talking about, it's there, it's happening. And again, as I posit, that this is because that truth calls us forward. So it's a brief glimpse into a local situation. The issues are much more complicated than I have been able to deliver in this paper. But I think the rich exchange of ideas, this sense of academic freedom, and a willingness to move beyond the limits of one's own experience have provided for a rich and fertile ground for liturgical renewal. And I think that this understanding of tradition as being something living, as Taft often says, that if you want to understand tradition, you have to see it like a top spinning. You have to understand it in motion and see what's going on. So Orientalem Ecclesiarum, Sacrosanctum Concilium were not just calling us to return to a fixed moment in history, but truly calling us as stewards of our faith communities to bring forward the wonders and beauties of communal worship in this body of Christ. And it's interesting to see how in the United States, at least in my experience, the polemical issues are not really there. And of course, especially at the academic level, we get along very well and work together on these issues because we're all seeking the same thing, the truth and the unity in Christ. So it's my hope that by our reflection on this as well, that we find a way to continue this important work so that we might enliven our body of Christ. Thank you.
So, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Morozowich, for your inspireful presentation and the liturgy as a living reality that permits exchange and reciprocal influences among the different churches. So while I invite Subdeacon Brian Butcher, if he is here, to join the panel, I will propose that we collect questions on the first two presentations before moving forward to the third speaker. So we have 7 minutes for questions on the first two presentations. So now the floor is yours. So I can start with the question for Roman Fijas regarding the landscape that you talk about. So currently, what are the possibilities of interconfessional dialogue in Ukraine? The real possibilities of interconfessional dialogue in Ukraine, especially between the Greek Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Are there any initiatives, any programs, any projects, any informal contacts?
Of course, there is no official theological dialogue between the churches, but our institute was created in 2004, and since that time we try to organize different ecumenical initiatives. For example, when sometimes the clergy or hierarchy of the church, it's very hard for them to sit together, so we can that was the task of our institute, to find some scholars among representatives of different Christian denominations and bring them together to sit at the one table. So we created a Ukrainian academic Christian fellowship, and we gathered around 20 academics, which were ready to regularly come to different places and to sit together at one table and to lead theological and social and other discussions. So another initiatives which have been realized by our institute is the cooperation between the seminaries, for example, because it's very important for those who study in the seminaries to be formed in different ways. That's why we organize ecumenical school for the seminaries belonging to different denominations, Greek Catholics, Orthodox and Protestants. And for 10 days we had common lectures, excursions, visits, discussions, and we had good feedbacks from the students, ruining their stereotypes against each other. So on the grassroots level, we could start with this small projects, with these small meetings and so on, but I think this is the seed which could grow later on to give fruits. Unfortunately, Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate is very close in itself. It's very hard to propose them to come to the dialogue not only with the Greek Catholics, but also with other Orthodox partner, or even with Constantinople, which I mentioned in my topic. So there are a couple of priests who want this dialogue, but they're situated under the pressure of the bishop. So this church has to be cleansed, to be purified in order to start a dialogue. Right now they're not ready, they're sitting in trenches and blaming everybody. But a very promising dialogue we can have with the newly created Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But because this church is a very new one, and it doesn't have recognition from another Orthodox churches in the world, only 4 or 5 churches recognize this church. So they're afraid to make like a very deep movement towards Greek Catholics in order to not to be blamed by other Orthodox. As well, the problem, as I mentioned already in my presentation, that the Orthodox Ukrainian Orthodox churches for many years, especially this of Kiev Patriarchate, have been isolated from the rest of the international Orthodoxy. And all of this clergy and training personnel were formed inside Ukraine. So they didn't have opportunity to be raised outside of Ukraine, where the international ecumenical relationship was developed and flourished. That's why we need time them to rethink their role within Ukraine and not too afraid to step forward with, for example, Greek Catholics, which has produced some schools, institutions, academics, and we are ready for such dialogue, but we can't push instead of them. We can't decide instead of them. Yeah,
if I could just add a question to there, Father Roman. We're talking like at more of an official level, but what's happening at the unofficial level with people who have come from east to west? And I know that there's just been this great displacement of people. Can you give us some sense of the relationships of people who've been members of like the Russian Orthodox Church, of the Ukrainian side that have come to various parts, and how those interactions have gone, and what are your thoughts about that part of this great movement of people in Ukraine today?
So, the biggest religious community in Ukraine, according to the official poll, is Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. But if, for example, you ask them, all the believers, what confession do you belong? Most would say they belong not to Moscow Patriarchate, but to Kiev Patriarchate or to Kievan Church. So there is a little bazaar in the head of the Orthodox people. In what confession do they belong? they go just to the church, to the priest, and the problem of a majority Orthodox people is that it's kind of traditional Orthodoxy. It's without attending regularly the church. So from time to time to go to the church and put the candle. That's why religious life is not very intense, for example, in East as it is in the West part of the country. When the IDPs people, those internally displaced people, come back, come to Lviv, some go to the Orthodox Church, some could go also to the Greek Catholic Church, and they, for example, start to learn how to confess because they never confessed in their life, for example. And this happens, but it's not only that this Greek Catholic want to grasp, to take all these people, but when the people are coming to the church, you can't just throw them away and stop to come in here. The same, I know, is the situation in Europe, where Orthodox Church of Ukraine can create its own parishes outside of Ukraine because of the Tomos, and they have only a few parishes outside of Ukraine. So people, when they come, they don't go to the Russian Orthodox Church, they prefer to go to the Greek Catholic Church instead. So, this discussion is still continue.
Okay. Any questions from the... Yeah, Pablo.
A question to Father Mark regarding this advice by the Ecumenical Directory. The question to Father Mark regarding the advice by the Directory for Applications of Norms on Ecumenism to have same versions of liturgical texts by churches who share the same liturgical tradition. So in Ukraine, although we have basically three major churches that belong to the Byzantine tradition, it has proven to be very difficult to use the same text. Everybody would use their own translation. Now in the US, we have a much greater variety of churches who follow Byzantine tradition. How do you navigate this? Have you been able to arrive to use the same versions of texts, to do translations together? How does it work?
Simple answer is no. Yeah, it's an ideal that, that we need to, sort of work toward and be there with. I think that fundamentally there are a few different strains, especially with the English language, and I think that, are you going to be a modern English language usage, or there are some people prefer the familiar form of the English language, the thee and the thou, although they probably think it's formal, and so that's why they want the thee and the thou, but it's really the familiar form of the English language. So there is that strain of translations that are out there. There hasn't been anything to this point, because those involve engagement with the hierarchy, and I've always found that engagement with scholars and the people in the pews is much more fruitful.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? No. Yeah, we can have one short question, short answer, please.
I have a liturgical question. How to distinguish from the ecumenical point of view, how to distinguish between the Latinization as a loss of identity, as a negative process, and the sharing of the heritage, of the liturgical heritage, of the spiritual gifts? Thank you.
I'm not sure what you meant by the sharing of the spiritual gifts.
For example, Ukrainian Greek Catholic practice the prayer of Rosary, of Byzantinized prayer of Rosary. Is it a Latinization, or is it a sharing of the gifts? Another example, Roman Catholic utilize the Byzantine icon for the celebration. Is it a negative process, or is it sharing of the heritage?
So on the whole issue about iconography, you're in the right city. Spend some time in Maria Maggiore, and you will have a sense of some of the iconography of Rome. If you've never been to the Forum, within the Forum, Santa Maria in Antigua is a beautiful church to go and visit. And so if you have just a few moments, it's I believe a 7th, 8th century church that was covered and we didn't see much of it, and it has frescoes. And they actually did a beautiful job, and they have projectors that give you a sense of what the frescoes were originally. So the usage of iconography is something that was common in the East as well as the West. So we need to do a lot of education, rethinking about what the ideals of the West are. So let me, and I know I need to be short here, so I will promise. But I think that when we look at the issues regarding Latinization, it's really about those things which take away from something. So those things which were imposed. One of the things that, again, I'm channeling Taft in these days, he would talk about the issues of frequent communion. Is that a Latinization? Well, some might say it was spurred by the Latin Church, but it's authentic and integral to the very meaning of what this is about. The same thing like I mentioned about the sacraments of initiation. This is something that's part of our tradition, part of our heritage. So when we're looking then about these other things, well, where does the place of the rosary have within that person's life? Some people said, well, is it the rosary that unites the world or the Eucharist that unites the world? So sometimes we need to think about, well, where is our theology and how are we explaining these things? My philosophy is that I like to encourage people in their spiritual practices, and at least when I was a pastor, I let the people practice and pray according to their own, liking. But I will share this, that I introduced the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts to Lindora, Pennsylvania back in 1993. This is how old this is already. And one 70-year-old woman came up to me and said, "Father, that is absolutely beautiful. How come I've never seen it before?" And that's the type of thing that I think we need to be promoting. We still kept a Stations of the Cross because I don't believe in just going in and changing people's lives. You're not going to change a 70-year-old who's been doing this and is incorporated in their life. Of course, they have spiritual benefits and you respect them. But as well, we need to be putting forward our own traditions and helping people to grow in love of those traditions.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much. So I think you can continue discussions later. So I'm happy to introduce you the last speaker of this session, Subdeacon